Ma'am, you need to step away from the VIP entrance. Keith Barrett's voice cut through Manhattan Federal Courthouse's marble rotunda as he moved toward the elegantly dressed black woman. Zaria Washington clutched her ceremonial folder, her judicial robes draped over her arm, marking her as someone important. Other courthouse staff entering for the swearing-in ceremony exchanged knowing looks. Another defendant's family member trying to sneak into the exclusive judicial wing. But then something extraordinary happened. The apologetic confusion in Zaria's voice disappeared. Her shoulders straightened. When she lifted her ceremonial invitation and looked directly at Keith, there was something burning in her dark eyes that made his commanding presence falter. "I'm not visiting anyone," she said, no longer explaining, calm, controlled, absolutely devastating. "I'm being sworn in today." Silence fell over the courthouse rotunda. Keith's radio stopped mid-call. Smirking staff members suddenly looked horrified, because everyone just realized they had blocked exactly the wrong person from her own ceremony. What happened next would destroy careers and reform America's entire courthouse security system. It had started perfectly for Zaria Washington. At 6:30 a.m., she stood in her Manhattan apartment, adjusting the black judicial robes that represented 15 years of relentless work. The mirror reflected back a woman who had overcome every obstacle the legal system could throw at her. Law review at Columbia, clerk for Supreme Court Justice Thompson, federal prosecutor for 8 years, and now, at 42, the youngest black woman ever appointed to the Federal District Court of Southern New York. Her phone buzzed with congratulatory messages. Dean Richards from Columbia Law, proud doesn't begin to cover it. Her mother from Atlanta. Your father would have been so proud, baby girl. Senator Williams, who had championed her nomination, history in the making. Maya Sterling, her brilliant young assistant, had already confirmed everything twice. The ceremony starts at 10 a.m. sharp. Chief Judge Hampton will perform the oath. The Attorney General himself is flying in from Washington. Press pool, federal marshals, the works. Zaria smiled, remembering the call 3 months ago. Ms. Washington, President Morrison had said personally, your nomination sailed through the Senate 89-11. The country needs judges who understand justice from every angle. The taxi ride to Lower Manhattan felt surreal. Through tinted windows, she watched the city wake up. Coffee vendors, early commuters, joggers in Central Park. None of them knew they were witnessing history. By noon, she would be the Honorable Judge Zaria Washington, with lifetime tenure and the power to shape American jurisprudence. Federal Courthouse, Pearl Street, she told the driver, her voice steady despite the butterflies. The building appeared like a temple of justice, towering granite columns, bronze doors, and steps where civil rights legends had once stood. At 9:45 a.m., Zaria approached the main entrance carrying her ceremonial folder and judicial robes. The morning sun illuminated the words carved in stone, "Equal justice under law." She paused, savoring the moment. In 15 minutes, she would take an oath that only 1/700 people in American history had taken as federal judges. That's when she heard the voice that would change everything. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the VIP entrance." Keith Barrett emerged from the security checkpoint, his 15 years of courthouse experience telling him exactly what he was seeing, another confused family member who didn't understand courtroom protocol. His weathered face showed the authority of someone who had handled thousands of similar situations. The woman was well-dressed. He'd give her that. Professional blazer, expensive briefcase, even carrying what looked like legal documents. But Barrett had seen it all. Defendants' mothers, sisters, girlfriends, all trying to look important, all trying to slip into areas where they didn't belong. "The public gallery entrance is around the corner," he continued, his tone professional but firm. "Family members wait in the designated area until proceedings begin." Other courthouse staff were arriving for what they knew was a significant day. The swearing-in of a new federal judge always brought heightened security, media attention, and VIP protocols. They watched the interaction with mild interest, just Barrett doing his job, keeping unauthorized personnel away from restricted areas. But something in the woman's posture made Barrett pause. She wasn't backing down or looking embarrassed like most people did when corrected. Instead, she stood taller, her grip tightening on that folder. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Zaria said, her voice carrying a controlled intensity that made nearby conversations stop. "I'm not here as a visitor." Barrett's training kicked in. Confident suspects were often the most dangerous. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification and an explanation of your business here." "My business," Zaria repeated slowly, "is being sworn in as a federal judge in exactly 12 minutes. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Barrett's hand moved instinctively toward his radio, but something in her tone made him hesitate. Around them, courthouse staff had stopped their conversations entirely. What they didn't know was that they were about to witness the moment when assumption met reality, and reality was about to win in the most devastating way possible. If you believe that no one should be judged by their appearance in America's courthouses, type justice below. The tension in the courthouse rotunda escalated like pressure building in a closed system. Keith Barrett studied Zaria Washington with the skeptical eye of a man who had heard every excuse, every false claim, every attempt to bypass security in his 15-year career. "Federal judge," he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I know every judge in this district. I've worked here longer than most of them have been on the bench." Gray Weatherby, Barrett's second-in-command, approached from the metal detectors. At 35, Gray had spent 8 years learning from Barrett, absorbing his mentor's certainty about reading people. The scene unfolding before him fit every pattern they'd been trained to recognize: unauthorized person, elaborate story, expensive clothes meant to deceive. "Problem here, Chief?" Gray asked, positioning himself to Barrett's left in a subtle show of force. "Lady says she's a federal judge," Barrett explained, never taking his eyes off Zaria. "Claims she's being sworn in today." Gray's eyebrows shot up. He'd been briefed on today's ceremony. Judge Zaria Washington, first black woman appointed to the Southern District in 5 years. Huge media presence expected. But the woman standing before them, she looked more like a defendant's well-dressed sister trying to gain access to restricted areas. "The judicial entrance is on the north side," Gray offered helpfully. "If you're really supposed to be here, that's where you'd go." Around them, the morning flow of courthouse personnel was beginning to notice the commotion. Assistant U.S. attorneys, court clerks, federal marshals, all pausing to watch what appeared to be a routine security issue. Zaria felt the familiar burn of injustice rising in her chest. She had spent her entire career fighting this moment. The automatic assumption, the casual dismissal, the burden of proving she belonged in spaces where her presence was questioned simply because of how she looked. "I am Judge Zaria Washington," she said, each word precise and deliberate. "I was confirmed by the U.S. Senate 3 months ago. My ceremony begins in 10 minutes. Barrett's expression hardened. In his experience, the more elaborate the lie, the more insistent the suspect became. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to show me some identification and step aside while we verify your story." "My story?" The words came out sharper than Zaria intended. Around them, she could see more people gathering, their expressions ranging from curious to knowing. She recognized the look, the same expression she'd seen in courtrooms when defendants made implausible claims. Maya Sterling rushed through the main entrance at 9:52 a.m., her arms full of last-minute paperwork and her phone buzzing with media inquiries. She spotted her boss immediately, not because she was expecting to find her there, but because Zaria was the only person in the rotunda who looked like she was about to explode. "Judge Washington!" Maya called out, relief flooding her voice. "I've been looking everywhere. The chief judge is asking for you in chambers." Barrett's head whipped toward the young woman. Maya Sterling. He knew her face from the dozens of times she'd escorted actual federal prosecutors through security. But this had to be some kind of mistake. "You know this woman?" he asked Maya. "Know her?" Maya's voice pitched higher with disbelief. "She's Judge Zaria Washington. She's being sworn in this morning. Didn't you get the security briefing?" Gray stepped forward, his confidence wavering for the first time. "The Judge Washington we're expecting is—" He paused, realizing how his next words would sound. "Is what?" Zaria asked, her voice carrying decades of courtroom authority. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Around them, the gathering crowd sensed they were witnessing something significant. Not just a security mix-up, but the collision of assumption and reality. Barrett's radio crackled to life. Barrett, this is dispatch. Chief Judge Hampton is asking about Judge Washington's location. Ceremony starts in 8 minutes. The words hit the rotunda like a physical force. Barrett's hand froze on his radio, his 15 years of certainty suddenly feeling like quicksand beneath his feet. That would be me, Zaria said quietly, but her voice carried to every corner of the now silent space. The Judge Washington they're looking for. Maya checked her watch frantically. We need to get you upstairs now. The Attorney General's already in chambers. The press pool is seated and... Hold on, Barrett interrupted, his voice strained. I need to verify this before anyone goes anywhere. But even as he spoke, he could see the certainty draining from Gray's face, could feel the shift in energy from the courthouse staff, who were beginning to recognize exactly what they were witnessing. What Barrett didn't realize was that his next decision, whether to admit his mistake or double down on his assumptions, would determine not just his own future, but the future of security protocols throughout the entire federal judiciary. Because when you're wrong about someone with the power to reshape the system, the consequences don't just affect you, they affect everyone. At 9:54 a.m., the Manhattan Federal Courthouse Rotunda transformed from a place of quiet morning routine into an arena where institutional assumptions would collide with undeniable reality. Keith Barrett stood at the epicenter, his radio still crackling with increasingly urgent requests for Judge Washington's whereabouts. Dispatch, this is Barrett, he said into his radio, his voice tight with growing panic. I need immediate verification on Judge Zaria Washington's physical description. The response came back quickly. African-American female, approximately 42 years old, 5'6", professional attire. Why are you asking, Barrett? She should be in chambers by now. Barrett's eyes slowly moved to Zaria, who stood with the patience of someone who had endured this exact scenario countless times before. Every detail matched perfectly, except for the one detail Barrett's training had never prepared him to expect. This can't be right, Gray whispered, but his conviction was cracking like ice under pressure. Maya Sterling's frustration finally boiled over. Are you serious right now? Do you people not know who you're talking to? She pulled out her phone, frantically scrolling through her contacts. I'm calling Chief Judge Hampton directly. No, Barrett said quickly, his authority reflexively asserting itself. Nobody makes any calls until we sort this out. That's when Zaria Washington did something that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. She laughed, not the bitter laugh of someone enjoying irony or the angry laugh of someone pushed too far. This was the laugh of someone who had seen this movie before and knew exactly how it would end. Mr. Barrett, she said, her voice carrying the measured authority that had silenced courtrooms from Atlanta to Manhattan, I'm going to make this very simple for you. She opened her ceremonial folder and pulled out a single document, her official commission signed by the President of the United States. The presidential seal caught the morning light streaming through the courthouse windows. This is my commission as a United States District Judge for the Southern District of New York, signed by President Morrison 3 months ago and confirmed by the Senate 89-11. She held it up so everyone could see. Would you like to read it out loud, or should I? The crowd that had gathered was no longer just curious courthouse staff. Word had spread quickly through the building's communication network and now included federal marshals, assistant prosecutors, and court clerks, all of whom recognized the document Zaria was holding. Barrett's face went white. In 15 years of security work, he had seen presidential commissions exactly 3 times, and each time they had been carried by white men in expensive suits who looked exactly like what he expected federal judges to look like. Barrett started, but his voice failed him. Let me help you, Zaria continued, her tone never rising but somehow filling the entire rotunda. What you're experiencing right now is cognitive dissonance. Your training told you to expect certain types of people in certain types of roles, and reality is challenging those expectations. Gray Weatherby took a step backward, finally understanding the magnitude of what they had done. Around them, courthouse staff were pulling out phones not to call for verification, but to document what everyone now realized was a career-ending moment of institutional discrimination. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from Chief Judge Hampton. Where is Judge Washington? Ceremony delayed, Attorney General asking questions. Judge Washington, Maya said urgently. We need to go. Now. But Zaria wasn't finished. She had spent 15 years watching moments like this play out in courtrooms across America, moments when bias revealed itself so clearly that pretending it didn't exist became impossible. "Mr. Barrett, I want you to think very carefully about your next words," she said, "because in about 3 minutes Chief Judge Hampton is going to come down here personally to find out why his ceremony is delayed. When he does, what explanation are you going to give him?" Barrett's training screamed at him to call for backup, to escalate the situation, to maintain control. But his survival instincts were beginning to override his training, whispering that he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and his next step would determine whether he fell or found solid ground. "There has to be some kind of mistake," he said weakly. "Oh, there's definitely been a mistake," Zaria agreed. "The question is whether you're going to compound it or correct it." The rotunda fell silent, except for the distant sounds of the courthouse coming to life around them. In chambers 3 floors above, the most powerful legal minds in the country were waiting. In the press gallery, reporters were checking their watches and adjusting their cameras. In the VIP section, senators and Supreme Court justices were taking their seats. And in the rotunda, a 42-year-old black woman stood holding a presidential commission, while 2 security guards decided whether to admit they had made the kind of mistake that destroys careers and becomes a case study in implicit bias training. What none of them knew was that their conversation was being recorded by multiple security cameras, and that footage would soon be reviewed by people with the power to reshape the entire federal courthouse security system. At 9:56 a.m., Keith Barrett made the decision that would define the rest of his career. Instead of acknowledging his mistake, instead of stepping aside and allowing Zaria Washington to proceed to her own swearing-in ceremony, he chose to double down. "Ma'am, I don't care what documents you have," he said, his voice gaining false confidence. "Security protocols exist for a reason, and I'm not going to compromise them based on paperwork that anyone could have printed." The words hit the rotunda like a physical blow. Around them, courthouse staff stopped pretending to go about their business and openly stared. Maya Sterling's mouth fell open in disbelief. "Printed?" Zaria repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "You think I printed a presidential commission?" But Barrett was committed now, his 15 years of unquestioned authority demanding that he maintain control of the situation. People try all kinds of things to get into restricted areas. Fake badges, forged documents, elaborate stories. I've seen it all. That's when Gray Weatherby made his own fatal decision. Instead of recognizing the obvious truth standing in front of him, he chose loyalty to his supervisor over evidence. "Chief's right," Gray said, moving closer to Zaria. "Until we can verify your identity through proper channels, you need to step away from the VIP entrance." "Step away?" Zaria's voice carried 15 years of courtroom authority and 42 years of dealing with exactly this kind of institutional blindness. "I am Zaria Washington. I was nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate, and I am supposed to be sworn in as a federal judge in 4 minutes." Maya frantically typed on her phone, trying to reach anyone in chambers who could end this insanity, but Barrett saw her movement and interpreted it as suspicious. "You need to put that phone down," he told Maya. "No unauthorized communications during a security situation." "Security situation?" Maya's voice pitched higher with disbelief. "This is Judge Washington. She's supposed to be upstairs right now." Barrett's radio crackled again. "Barrett, Chief Judge Hampton is personally asking for Judge Washington's location. What's your status?" The irony was lost on Barrett. He was being asked to locate the exact person he was preventing from entering her own courthouse. "Dispatch, I have a situation in the rotunda. Unauthorized person claiming to be Judge Washington. Requesting backup for verification." Around them, the crowd was growing larger and more uncomfortable. Federal marshals who knew Zaria from her prosecutorial days were beginning to recognize her. Assistant attorneys who had argued cases before her during her brief stint as a visiting judge were pulling out their phones to record what they realized was an unprecedented security failure. But Barrett couldn't see what everyone else could see. His worldview, shaped by 15 years of assumptions about who belonged where, had created a blind spot so massive that presidential commissions became printed documents and Senate confirmations became elaborate stories. "Sir," Zaria said, her patience finally wearing thin. "I'm going to give you one more opportunity to step aside." "Are you threatening me?" Barrett asked, his hand moving toward his radio. "I'm not threatening you," Zaria replied with the calm precision that had made her famous in federal courtrooms. "I'm informing you that you are currently obstructing a federal judge from performing her constitutional duties, which is a federal crime." The legal weight of her words hit the rotunda like a thunderclap. Barrett's hand froze halfway to his radio as the implications began to penetrate his certainty. But it was too late for rational thought. Barrett had painted himself into a corner, and the only way out was through. "Ma'am, I need you to put your hands where I can see them and step away from the entrance." The words fell like dominoes, each one sealing Barrett's fate more completely than the last. Around them, courthouse staff began backing away, recognizing that they were witnessing not just a mistake, but a catastrophe in real time. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from Chief Judge Hampton himself. "Find Judge Washington immediately. Ceremony cannot proceed without her." At exactly that moment, Gray Weatherby made the decision that would transform this from a security misunderstanding into a federal incident. He reached for Zaria's arm. "Ma'am, you need to come with us for questioning." The physical contact changed everything. The moment Gray's hand touched Zaria Washington's arm, he wasn't just making a security error, he was committing assault on a federal judge. Zaria pulled her arm back sharply. "Do not touch me." But Gray, following Barrett's lead and his own assumptions, interpreted her resistance as suspicious behavior requiring force. "Ma'am, you need to comply with security instructions." He reached for her again, this time with both hands, intending to escort her away from the VIP entrance. That's when the situation exploded into something that would make national headlines and congressional hearings. Because when you put your hands on a federal judge, even if you don't know she's a federal judge, you've crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. What they discovered next would destroy everything they believed about their own judgment and change courthouse security forever. The moment Gray Weatherby's hands made contact with Judge Zaria Washington's arms, time seemed to slow in the courthouse rotunda. What had been a case of mistaken identity was about to become a federal assault charge, witnessed by dozens of courthouse personnel and recorded by multiple security cameras. "Sir, remove your hands from me immediately," Zaria commanded, her voice carrying the full authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. But Gray had committed to his course of action. In his mind, he was dealing with an increasingly agitated, unauthorized person who needed to be removed from a secure area. His training told him to maintain control, establish compliance, and deal with the consequences later. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," Gray said, tightening his grip on her arms and attempting to guide her toward the security office. That's when Zaria Washington did something that neither security guard expected. She planted her feet and refused to move. "I'm ordering you to release me," she said, her voice rising for the first time. "I am a federal judge, and you are committing assault." Barrett, seeing his subordinate struggling with what he still believed was a difficult suspect, made his own fateful decision to intervene physically. "Ma'am, we can do this the easy way or the hard way," Barrett said, moving to Gray's assistance. "But you're coming with us." The sight of two grown men attempting to physically remove an elegantly dressed woman from the courthouse rotunda finally galvanized the watching crowd into action. "Stop!" shouted Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Coleman, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing horror. "That's Judge Washington. You're assaulting a federal judge." But Barrett and Gray were beyond hearing reason. They had committed to their path, and every moment of resistance from Zaria only confirmed in their minds that they were dealing with someone dangerous who needed to be controlled. Gray attempted to maneuver Zaria toward the wall, intending to search her for weapons before escorting her to the security office. But Zaria, who had spent years learning to project authority in hostile environments, knew that once they got her into a confined space, the situation would become infinitely worse. "I said remove your hands," Zaria shouted, her voice now carrying to every corner of the rotunda. Maya Sterling, watching her boss being physically manhandled by courthouse security, made a decision that would later be cited in congressional testimony. She started filming with her phone. "This is Judge Zaria Washington being assaulted by courthouse security," she said clearly into her phone's microphone. The time is 9:58 a.m. on the day of her swearing-in ceremony. The word filming cut through Barrett's tunnel vision like a knife. Suddenly aware that his actions were being recorded, he momentarily loosened his grip on Zaria's arm. But Gray, unaware of the recording and frustrated by Zaria's continued resistance, made the decision that would end his career and trigger a federal investigation. He shoved Zaria against the marble wall. The impact was audible, a sharp sound that echoed through the rotunda and silenced every conversation within 50 feet. Zaria's ceremonial folder scattered across the floor, her presidential commission sliding across the marble like an accusation. "You're under arrest for trespassing and resisting security," Gray announced, reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. The words hung in the air like poison. Around them, the courthouse staff watched in horror as a federal judge, still in her ceremonial attire, still carrying her presidential commission, was about to be handcuffed by the very security force meant to protect her. That's when Cole Hampton, Chief Judge of the Southern District of New York, emerged from the elevator. Hampton had come downstairs personally because his ceremony was now 15 minutes behind schedule. The Attorney General was asking pointed questions, and no one could locate the guest of honor. What he found was a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his judicial career. "What in God's name is happening here?" Hampton's voice boomed across the rotunda with the authority of 30 years on the federal bench. Barrett turned toward the familiar voice, his hands still restraining Zaria against the wall. "Chief Judge, we have a situation. Unauthorized person claiming to be Judge Washington, becoming increasingly agitated." Hampton's eyes moved from Barrett to Gray, to the woman they had pinned against the wall. His face went white as recognition hit him like a physical blow. "You idiots!" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Then, louder, "You absolute idiots! That is Judge Washington!" The words echoed through the rotunda like a judge's gavel, final and absolute. Barrett's hands fell away from Zaria as if she had suddenly become radioactive. Gray, still processing Hampton's words, looked down at the handcuffs in his hands as if seeing them for the first time. And Zaria Washington, federal judge, stood against the marble wall of her own courthouse, her ceremonial robes disheveled, her dignity intact, but her faith in the system she had devoted her life to serving shaken to its foundation. The courthouse rotunda became a tableau of frozen horror as Chief Judge Cole Hampton's words echoed off the marble walls. "That is Judge Washington." Barrett's face drained of color as if someone had opened a valve. Gray Weatherby stared at the handcuffs in his hands like they were radioactive. Around them, dozens of courthouse personnel stood witnessing what would become the most documented security failure in federal judicial history. Zaria Washington slowly straightened her blazer, her movements deliberate and controlled, despite the tremor in her hands. She had endured verbal discrimination countless times in her career, but physical assault in her own courthouse, on the day of her swearing-in, represented a violation so profound that it would require systemic change to address. "Judge Washington," Chief Judge Hampton said, his voice thick with horror and embarrassment, "I cannot begin to express—" "Chief Judge," Zaria interrupted quietly, "I think we need to discuss this in chambers, immediately." Maya Sterling continued filming, her hands shaking as she documented the aftermath. "This is the immediate aftermath of the assault on Judge Zaria Washington by courthouse security," she narrated for the recording. "Chief Judge Hampton has confirmed her identity." Barrett finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. We didn't... The briefing said what exactly?" Zaria asked, her prosecutorial instincts taking over. "What description were you given that led you to believe I couldn't possibly be a federal judge?" The question hung in the air like an indictment. Barrett realized that any answer he gave would only make his situation worse. The briefing had included Judge Washington's race, age, and general description, information that should have made identification immediate and certain. Gray was staring at Zaria with dawning comprehension. "You really are. Oh God, what have we done?" "What you've done," Chief Judge Hampton said, his voice gaining strength and authority, "is assault a federal judge, obstruct a constitutional ceremony, and create an incident that will require investigation by the FBI, the Judicial Council, and probably Congress." The weight of those words hit Barrett like a physical blow. 15 years of service, a clean record, retirement benefits, all of it potentially gone because he had seen a black woman in judicial robes and assumed she was lying about her identity. Maya's phone buzzed with an urgent call. She answered without stopping her recording. "Maya, this is Senator Williams. I'm in the ceremonial courtroom and we're hearing disturbing reports. Is Judge Washington all right?" "Senator," Maya said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Judge Washington was just physically assaulted by courthouse security who didn't believe she was a federal judge." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of traffic from the street outside became audible. "Put me on speaker," Senator Williams commanded. Maya complied, and the senator's voice filled the rotunda. "This is Senator Williams, chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I need to speak with Chief Judge Hampton immediately." Hampton took the phone with hands that weren't quite steady. "Senator Williams, this is Cole Hampton. I can confirm that there has been a serious security incident involving Judge Washington." "How serious?" Williams asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had shepherded Zaria's nomination through the Senate. Hampton looked around the rotunda, at the scattered documents, the crowd of witnesses, the security guards who were beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. "Serious enough to delay the ceremony and require a full federal investigation," Hampton replied. On the phone, Senator Williams was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Chief Judge, I need you to secure that scene. Nobody leaves, nobody talks to press, and nobody touches any potential evidence. The Attorney General needs to be briefed immediately." Barrett felt his legs go weak. The Attorney General, the nation's top law enforcement officer, was already in the building for the ceremony. Now he would be investigating Barrett for assaulting the judge he had come to swear in. Zaria picked up her scattered documents, including her presidential commission, which now bore scuff marks from sliding across the marble floor. Each crease and mark represented not just physical damage, but symbolic damage to the institution she had devoted her life to serving. "Chief Judge," she said quietly, "I need a moment to collect myself before we proceed with any ceremony." "Of course," Hampton replied. "Judge Washington, please know that this incident will be investigated with the full resources of the federal judiciary. There will be accountability." Gray Weatherby finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Judge Washington, we're sorry, we made a terrible mistake." Zaria looked at him with the steady gaze that had unnerved opposing counsel for 15 years. "Mr. Weatherby, you didn't make a mistake. You made an assumption, and that assumption led you to physically assault a federal judge in her own courthouse." The distinction was crucial, and everyone in the rotunda understood it. Mistakes were accidental. Assumptions were choices based on bias. Maya's recording captured what happened next. Chief Judge Hampton ordering the rotunda cleared except for essential personnel, Barrett and Gray being escorted to separate offices for questioning, and Judge Zaria Washington walking slowly toward the elevator that would take her to chambers, where the most powerful legal minds in the country were waiting to learn why their ceremony had been derailed. In the secure conference room adjacent to Chief Judge Hampton's chambers, an emergency meeting was convening that would determine whether the courthouse assault on Judge Washington would be handled quietly or become a national scandal. Present were Chief Judge Hampton, Attorney General Rebecca Torres, who had flown in from Washington for the ceremony, Deputy U.S. Marshal Patricia Reed, and Courthouse Administrator David Kim. Notably absent was Judge Washington herself, who had requested 30 minutes to compose herself before any formal discussions. "Let me understand this correctly," Attorney General Torres said, her voice carrying the controlled fury of someone who had just watched 15 years of judicial diversity progress potentially destroyed in a single morning. 2 courthouse security guards physically assaulted Judge Washington because they didn't believe she was actually a judge. "That appears to be the substance of what occurred," Hampton replied carefully. Torres had not become the nation's top law enforcement officer by accepting careful non-answers. "Chief Judge, I need specifics. What exactly did your security personnel do to a sitting federal judge?" David Kim, the courthouse administrator, consulted his notes with trembling hands. Based on preliminary witness accounts, verbal confrontation, physical restraint, forced positioning against a wall, and attempted arrest with handcuffs. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Torres closed her eyes briefly, calculating the political ramifications. Judge Washington's nomination had been a cornerstone of the administration's commitment to judicial diversity. Photos of her being manhandled by courthouse security would be on every news channel within hours. "How many witnesses?" Torres asked. "Approximately 30 courthouse personnel," Kim replied. "Plus video from multiple security cameras and at least 3 cell phone recordings." "Jesus Christ," Torres muttered. "This is going to be a nightmare." That's when Deputy Marshal Reed made a suggestion that would later feature prominently in congressional testimony. Maybe it doesn't have to be. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implication. "Explain," Hampton said carefully. Reed leaned forward, his 20-year career in federal law enforcement having taught him how to manage difficult situations. "Look, everyone makes mistakes. Barrett and Weatherby made a serious error in judgment, but they were trying to do their jobs. Judge Washington is a reasonable person. Maybe we can handle this internally." "Internally how?" Torres asked. "Disciplinary action for the guards, additional training protocols, a formal apology from the court," Reed outlined. "Judge Washington gets her ceremony, her dignity is restored, and we avoid turning this into a federal case that damages everyone involved." Kim nodded eagerly. "We could frame it as a learning opportunity. New security protocols, implicit bias training, better communication systems." Hampton found himself considering the proposal despite every instinct telling him it was wrong. A quiet resolution would protect the court's reputation, preserve careers, and allow everyone to move forward. But it would also require Judge Washington's cooperation in minimizing an assault that had been witnessed by dozens and recorded by multiple cameras. "The problem," Torres said slowly, "is that this isn't just a courthouse incident anymore. This is a federal judge being assaulted while carrying a presidential commission. The optics alone." "Which is exactly why we need to control the narrative," Reed interrupted. "Every minute we delay gives this story time to grow. By evening, it'll be on social media. By tomorrow, it'll be congressional hearings." Kim pulled up security footage on his tablet. "The video is problematic. It clearly shows physical contact, restraint against the wall, and attempted handcuffing, but context matters. We could emphasize the security confusion, the training gaps." "You want to blame training for racism?" Torres asked incredulously. "Not racism," Reed said quickly. "Procedural failures, communication breakdowns, insufficient identification protocols." Hampton's phone buzzed with a text from Senator Williams. "Spoke with Judge Washington. She's considering options. Situation is salvageable if handled correctly." The message gave Reed hope. "See? Even Senator Williams thinks we can manage this appropriately." But what Reed didn't know was that Senator Williams had sent that text before speaking with Judge Washington. The conversation that had just concluded in the judge's temporary office had been very different from what the senator had led them to believe. 20 minutes earlier, Judge Washington had sat across from Senator Williams in a small conference room, her judicial robe still wrinkled from the physical confrontation, her presidential commission now bearing visible scuff marks. "Zaria," Williams had said, "I know this was traumatic, but we need to think strategically. Your judicial career is just beginning. A federal investigation, media circus, congressional hearings, it could overshadow everything you accomplish on the bench." Judge Washington had listened with the patience she brought to complex legal arguments. Then she had asked a single question that changed everything. "Senator, if this had happened to a white male judge, would you be suggesting the same approach?" The silence that followed answered everything. Back in the emergency meeting, Torres was reviewing the legal implications. "Even if Judge Washington agrees to handle this quietly, we still have potential criminal charges. Assault on a federal official, obstruction of judicial proceedings, civil rights violations. Which is why we need her cooperation," Reed pressed. "With Judge Washington's support, we can characterize this as a training issue that's been corrected rather than a criminal matter requiring prosecution." Kim's tablet chimed with an urgent message from courthouse security. Media vehicles arriving outside. Multiple news vans on Pearl Street. "Shit," Torres muttered. "How did they find out so fast?" The answer came in the form of Maya Sterling's Twitter account, which had posted a 30-second video clip with the caption, Judge Zaria Washington assaulted by courthouse security on her swearing-in day. This is America's federal judiciary in 2024. The video had already been retweeted 847 times in 12 minutes. Hampton's face went pale as he watched his courthouse's reputation disintegrating in real time. "Can we ask them to take it down?" "Are you insane?" Torres snapped. "Asking a federal judge's staff to delete evidence of her assault? That's obstruction, tampering with evidence, and about 6 other federal crimes." Reed's phone rang. The caller ID showed Barrett's personal number. "Keith, what are you doing calling me? You should be in isolation until—" "Deputy Reed." Barrett's voice was strained and desperate. "Gray and we've been talking. We think we should make a statement, explain our side before this gets out of hand." "Your side?" Reed asked incredulously. "Keith, you assaulted a federal judge. There is no your side." "But we didn't know. If we had known she was really Judge Washington—" Reed hung up, realizing that Barrett was so deep in denial that he still didn't understand the fundamental problem. It wasn't that they had assaulted Judge Washington specifically. It was that they had assumed a black woman couldn't possibly be a federal judge and acted on that assumption with physical force. Torres checked her own phone and saw 17 missed calls from the White House press secretary. The story was already reaching the highest levels of government. "Chief Judge," she said formally, "I need to ask you directly. Are you planning to recommend that this matter be handled administratively rather than criminally?" Hampton looked around the room at faces that represented decades of federal service, careers that could be destroyed by the wrong decision in the next few minutes. That's when his secretary knocked on the door. "Chief Judge?" "Judge Washington is here. She says she's ready to discuss the incident and her decision about how to proceed." The door opened and Judge Zaria Washington entered the room. She had changed into fresh judicial robes, her bearing dignified and composed. But something in her eyes had changed, a hardness that hadn't been there that morning. "Attorney General Torres, Chief Judge Hampton, gentlemen," she said formally. "I've had time to consider my options regarding this morning's assault." Reed leaned forward hopefully. "Judge Washington, we were just discussing ways to handle this matter that would serve everyone's interests. Mr. Reed," Judge Washington interrupted, her voice carrying the authority that had made her famous in federal courtrooms, "I need to be very clear about something. There is no version of today's events that serves everyone's interests. What happened to me was not a mistake, an error in judgment, or a training failure. It was the predictable result of systemic bias that assumes black women don't belong in positions of authority." The room fell silent. "And I will not be a party to covering it up. These stories of justice inspire people all around the world. Let us know what country and city you're watching from, so we can see how far these powerful messages are reaching." The silence in Chief Judge Hampton's conference room was so complete that the sound of protesters gathering outside the courthouse could be heard through the windows. Judge Zaria Washington's words, "I will not be a party to covering it up," had shifted the entire dynamic of the room. Attorney General Torres studied the judge's face, recognizing the expression of someone who had made a decision that would not be changed by political pressure or career considerations. "Judge Washington," Torres said carefully, "I want to be clear that no one is asking you to cover anything up. We're discussing how to ensure that justice is served while protecting the integrity of the federal judiciary." "With respect, General Torres," Zaria replied, "those two goals are not in conflict unless you believe that acknowledging bias in the federal judiciary somehow damages it more than allowing that bias to continue unchecked." Deputy Marshal Reed shifted uncomfortably. "Judge, surely you understand that a prolonged investigation, media attention, congressional hearings, it could overshadow your entire judicial career." Zaria's smile was sharp and knowing. "Mr. Reed, are you suggesting that I prioritize my career over the principle that federal judges should be able to enter their own courthouses without being assaulted by security?" Hampton finally found his voice. "Judge Washington, what exactly are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing anything, Chief Judge. I'm informing you of what will happen." Zaria's voice carried the authority of 15 years in federal courtrooms. "This incident will be investigated by the FBI, the Inspector General's office, and whoever else has jurisdiction. The security footage will be preserved and analyzed. The witnesses will be interviewed. and the systemic failures that led to this assault will be identified and corrected. Reed made one last attempt at damage control. Judge, think about the bigger picture. Your confirmation was historic. The first black woman on this court in 5 years. Do you really want your legacy to be defined by this incident? The question hit the room like a physical force. Everyone present understood the implication. Judge Washington should accept the assault quietly to protect her own reputation and that of the institution. Zaria stood slowly, her judicial robes seeming to grow heavier with authority. Mr. Reed, let me explain something about legacy. If I allow this incident to be minimized, covered up or explained away, then every black woman who comes after me will face the same assumptions, the same barriers, the same potential for violence that I face today. She moved to the window, where the sound of gathering protesters was growing louder. My legacy isn't about being the first black woman on this court quietly and gratefully. My legacy is about ensuring I'm not the last black woman to face discrimination, and that those who come after me can serve with the dignity and respect that every federal judge deserves. Torres closed her laptop with a decisive snap. Judge Washington is right. This matter will be investigated fully and transparently. I'll be calling the FBI director personally. Kim looked up from his tablet with alarm. Her Attorney General, the story is already trending nationally. Judge Washington has over 50,000 tweets. Good, Zaria said simply. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. Hampton's phone rang. The caller ID showed White House switchboard. Chief Judge Hampton, the voice said, please hold for the president. The room fell silent as Hampton put the call on speaker. Cole, this is President Morrison. I'm hearing disturbing reports about Judge Washington. Is she all right? Hampton looked at Zaria, who nodded permission for him to respond. Mr. President, Judge Washington is physically unharmed, but there was a serious security incident this morning. How serious? Torres leaned toward the phone. Mr. President, this is Rebecca Torres. Judge Washington was physically assaulted by courthouse security who didn't believe she was actually a federal judge. The silence from the White House stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Let me understand this, President Morrison finally said. The judge I personally nominated, who was confirmed by the Senate, was assaulted by security at her own courthouse on the day of her swearing in. Yes, sir, Torres replied, and she's standing right there listening to this conversation. Yes, Mr. President, Zaria said. I'm here. Judge Washington, first, I want to apologize on behalf of the federal government. What happened to you is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. Second, I want you to know that you have the full support of this administration in whatever course of action you choose to pursue. Thank you, Mr. President. Rebecca, I want a full investigation. FBI Inspector General, Civil Rights Division, whatever resources you need, and I want regular updates sent directly to my desk. Understood, sir. Judge Washington, one more thing. When you're ready, and only when you're ready, I'd like to personally administer your oath of office. The ceremony this morning may have been disrupted, but your service to this country will not be diminished by the failures of others. As the president hung up, Reed realized that any hope of containing the situation had just evaporated. This was no longer a courthouse incident to be managed quietly. It was a national crisis that would reshape how the federal judiciary addressed bias and discrimination. Maya Sterling's phone buzzed with a call from CNN. Then ABC. Then the Washington Post. The story was no longer about a security misunderstanding. It was about whether America's federal courts could protect their own judges from the very bias they were supposed to eliminate from the justice system. What the investigation revealed would shock the entire nation and expose a pattern of discrimination that went far deeper than anyone imagined. 48 hours after the assault on Judge Zaria Washington, FBI Special Agent Carmen Rodriguez sat in a commandeered conference room at the Manhattan Federal Courthouse, surrounded by evidence that painted a devastating picture of systemic bias in federal court security. The investigation had moved with unprecedented speed, driven by direct orders from the president and intense media scrutiny. What Rodriguez and her team had uncovered in just 2 days would ultimately lead to congressional hearings and a complete overhaul of federal courthouse security protocols. Agent Rodriguez, said Inspector General Michael Chen, reviewing the preliminary findings. "Walk me through what we know so far." Rodriguez consulted her notes, accumulated through interviews with 37 witnesses, analysis of security footage from 12 different cameras, and review of courthouse security protocols dating back 5 years. "The assault on Judge Washington was not an isolated incident," Rodriguez began. "It was the culmination of a pattern of discriminatory behavior that has been documented but never addressed." She pulled up a presentation on the conference room screen. "In the past 3 years, courthouse security has challenged the credentials of black attorneys 247% more frequently than white attorneys. Black federal employees are stopped and questioned at 340% the rate of their white colleagues, and black visitors, even those with proper authorization, are subjected to additional screening 89% of the time." Chen leaned forward. "You're saying this was predictable?" "I'm saying this was inevitable," Rodriguez replied. "The security briefing for Judge Washington's ceremony included her photograph, her biographical information, and explicit instructions that she would be arriving for her swearing-in. Barrett and Weatherby had access to all of that information, but they still didn't recognize her." Rodriguez pulled up the security footage from that morning. "They didn't recognize her because they weren't looking for her. Their training and experience had taught them that federal judges look a certain way, and Judge Washington didn't fit that profile." The footage played in slow motion, Zaria approaching the VIP entrance, Barrett intercepting her, the escalation from verbal confrontation to physical assault. Each frame told the story of assumptions becoming actions. "What about Barrett's claim that he was just following protocol?" Chen asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Rodriguez said, advancing to the next slide. "We interviewed every security guard who has worked in this courthouse over the past 5 years. Not one of them could recall a single instance where a white person claiming to be a federal judge was physically restrained for identification purposes. The implications hit the room like a physical force." "We also found these," Rodriguez continued, pulling up a series of emails and text messages recovered from Barrett's phone. "Internal communications between security staff that show a consistent pattern of racial profiling, disguised as heightened vigilance." The messages were damning. Another one trying to get into the judge's elevator. "Told her family court is downstairs. Dress nice, think they belong everywhere." Had to escort another confused visitor back to public areas. Each message was time-stamped and cross-referenced with security logs. The pattern was undeniable. Chen closed his eyes. "How did this go unnoticed for so long?" "It didn't go unnoticed," Rodriguez replied grimly. "It was reported. Multiple times." She pulled up a thick file of complaints, formal and informal, dating back 3 years. 17 separate incidents of racial profiling reported by attorneys, federal employees, and visitors. Each one was investigated by courthouse administration and determined to be misunderstandings or communication issues. Who was conducting these investigations? David Kim, the courthouse administrator, with input from Barrett himself. The conflict of interest was staggering. Barrett had been investigating complaints about his own department's behavior. Rodriguez's phone buzzed with an urgent message from her field office. She read it quickly, her expression growing grim. "What is it?" Chen asked. "We just received a call from the National Association of Black Attorneys. They're filing a class action lawsuit against the federal judiciary, alleging systematic discrimination in courthouse access and treatment." Chen rubbed his temples. "How many plaintiffs?" "Over 200 so far, from courthouses across the country. Judge Washington's assault opened the floodgates. The investigation had revealed that the Manhattan Federal Courthouse was not an anomaly. It was representative of a much larger problem throughout the federal court system." Rodriguez pulled up a map of the United States, with federal courthouses marked in different colors. Preliminary data from the Administrative Office of the Courts shows similar patterns in 73% of federal courthouses nationwide. "This is a constitutional crisis," Chen muttered. "Yes, it is," Rodriguez agreed, "and it's about to get worse." She displayed the final slide of her presentation, a timeline showing when various court officials had been made aware of the discrimination patterns and how they had responded. Chief Judge Hampton received formal complaints about Barrett's department in March, June, and September of last year. Each time, he accepted Barrett's explanation that the incidents were misunderstandings. Attorney General Torres was briefed on courthouse security issues during her confirmation hearings, but was told that diversity and inclusion training had addressed any concerns. Chen stared at the timeline, understanding the implications. "You're telling me that senior officials knew there was a problem and failed to act. I'm telling you that Judge Washington was assaulted by a system that had been warned repeatedly that its practices were discriminatory and chose to prioritize institutional reputation over individual safety." The door to the conference room opened, and Maya Sterling entered with a box of additional evidence. "Agent Rodriguez," Maya said, "we found something else. Judge Washington asked me to go through her files from her time as a prosecutor. She remembered being questioned by courthouse security several times when she was appearing before this same court." Rodriguez opened the box to find detailed notes Zaria had kept about each incident, dates, times, witnesses, and the specific language used by security personnel. "She documented everything," Maya continued. "Even as a prosecutor, even when she was arguing cases in this building regularly, she was stopped and questioned about her right to be here." Chen looked at the evidence surrounding them. Video footage, complaint records, discriminatory communications, and now personal documentation going back years. "This isn't just about two security guards making a mistake," he said quietly. "This is about a federal court system that has systematically failed to protect the dignity and safety of black legal professionals." Rodriguez nodded. "And tomorrow we start interviewing the people who let it happen." The emergency hearing room in the Manhattan Federal Courthouse had been transformed into an investigation center, where the most powerful figures in the federal judiciary would be forced to explain how systematic discrimination had flourished under their watch. Judge Zaria Washington sat at the witness table, no longer the victim of an assault, but a federal judge providing testimony that would reshape American courthouse security. 3 days had passed since the incident, and she had used that time to compile evidence that painted a devastating picture of institutional failure. "Judge Washington," FBI Special Agent Rodriguez began, "please describe for the record your experience with courthouse security prior to your swearing-in ceremony." Zaria opened a file folder thick with documentation. "Agent Rodriguez, over the past 4 years, while serving as a federal prosecutor and visiting judge, I was stopped and questioned by courthouse security in this building 17 times. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Inspector General Chen leaned forward. 17 times? Yes. Each time I was asked to provide additional identification beyond my federal credentials. Each time I was required to explain my business in the courthouse despite having proper authorization. And in 6 instances, I was escorted to verify my identity even though I was a regular participant in court proceedings." Rodriguez displayed Zaria's meticulously kept records on the room's screens. "Judge Washington, did you observe similar treatment of your white colleagues?" "No. In 4 years of regular courthouse visits, I never witnessed a white attorney or prosecutor being subjected to additional screening, escorting, or identity verification." Chief Judge Hampton, who had been called to testify, shifted uncomfortably at the defense table. His attorney had advised him that his responses could determine whether he faced criminal charges for willful blindness to civil rights violations. "Judge Washington," Rodriguez continued, "did you ever file formal complaints about these incidents?" "I raised concerns informally with courthouse administration 3 times. Each time I was told that security was just being thorough and that I should appreciate their attention to detail." Rodriguez turned to face Hampton. "Chief Judge Hampton, you're under oath. Were you ever made aware of Judge Washington's concerns about discriminatory treatment?" Hampton's attorney whispered urgently in his ear before he responded. "I recall some general discussions about courthouse security protocols, but nothing that rose to the level of formal discrimination complaints." "Really?" Rodriguez pulled up an email chain. "This is a message from Judge Washington to your office dated March 15th of last year. Would you like me to read it aloud?" Hampton's face went pale as he recognized the email he had dismissed as a misunderstanding. "Agent Rodriguez," Zaria interrupted, "if I may, I'd like to read my own words." She pulled up the email on her tablet. "Chief Judge Hampton, I am writing to formally document a concerning pattern of security interactions that appear to be based on racial profiling rather than legitimate security concerns. As a federal prosecutor with regular business in this courthouse, I should not be subjected to additional screening and verification procedures that are not applied to my white colleagues. This differential treatment creates a hostile work environment and undermines the dignity of legal proceedings. The silence in the room was deafening. "How did you respond to that email, Chief Judge?" Rodriguez asked. Hampton consulted his own records with shaking hands. "I forwarded it to David Kim for investigation and appropriate response." "And what was the result of that investigation?" Mr. Kim reported back that he had spoken with security staff and found no evidence of discriminatory behavior. Rodriguez turned to David Kim, who was scheduled to testify next. "Mr. Kim, describe the investigation you conducted." Kim's voice was barely audible. "I spoke with Keith Barrett, who assured me that security procedures were being applied consistently to all courthouse visitors." "You interviewed Keith Barrett about complaints regarding Keith Barrett's department?" The conflict of interest was so obvious that Kim couldn't even attempt to defend it. Attorney General Torres, observing from the gallery, made notes that would later form the basis for criminal referrals. The systematic nature of the cover-up was becoming undeniable. "Judge Washington," Rodriguez continued, "fast forward to the morning of your swearing-in ceremony. When Barrett and Weatherby first approached you, what was your initial reaction?" "Resignation," Zaria replied simply. "I thought, here we go again. It never occurred to me that on the day I was becoming a federal judge, security would physically assault me. I expected discrimination. I had experienced it repeatedly in that building. But I didn't expect violence." Those words, "I expected discrimination," would later be cited in congressional hearings as evidence of how normalized bias had become in the federal courthouse system. Rodriguez displayed the security footage one more time. "Judge Washington, at what point did you realize this incident was different from your previous experiences?" "When Mr. Weatherby put his hands on me," Zaria replied, her voice steady but her eyes reflecting the trauma of the moment. "That's when I understood that their assumptions about who I was and what I was doing there had escalated beyond verbal humiliation to physical assault." "And how did that make you feel?" Zaria paused, choosing her words carefully. "It made me realize that no amount of education, achievement, or institutional authority would protect me from the assumption that I didn't belong in spaces of power. If they could assault a federal judge carrying a presidential commission in her own courthouse, then no black woman in America was safe from the consequences of other people's bias." The room remained silent as the full weight of her testimony settled over everyone present. Rodriguez looked at her notes, then at the people whose careers and reputations hung in the balance. "Judge Washington, what do you believe needs to happen to ensure that no federal judge or any person experiences what you experienced?" Zaria's answer would reshape federal courthouse security across the entire United States. Judge Zaria Washington's recommendations for systemic reform filled 14 pages of typed testimony, but her core message could be summarized in a single sentence. Federal courthouses must become places where justice is not only administered, but actually practiced. The emergency hearing had evolved into something unprecedented in federal judicial history. A sitting judge providing testimony that would result in criminal charges against courthouse personnel and administrative reforms affecting every federal court in America. "Judge Washington," Inspector General Chen said, "you've outlined comprehensive reforms. Let's start with immediate personnel actions." Zaria consulted her notes with the precision that had made her famous as a prosecutor. Keith Barrett and Gray Weatherby should be terminated immediately and face federal assault charges. Their actions were not mistakes. They were the predictable result of bias that was allowed to flourish without consequence. In the back of the room, Barrett's attorney frantically scribbled notes while Barrett himself stared at the table. The security footage had made any defense impossible. The only question was whether he would plea bargain or face trial. "What about administrative accountability?" Chen continued. "Chief Judge Hampton and Administrator Kim should be removed from their positions," Zaria stated without hesitation. They received multiple complaints about discriminatory security practices and failed to take meaningful action. Their willful blindness enabled the assault I experienced. Hampton's face drained of color. 30 years on the federal bench, a reputation built on fairness and judicial temperament, all of it potentially destroyed because he had chosen to trust Barrett's explanations rather than investigate discrimination complaints. "Judge Washington," Attorney General Torres interjected, "those are serious allegations against senior court officials. Are you prepared to support those recommendations with evidence?" "I am," Zaria replied, pulling out a thick binder. "This contains documentation of 17 separate discrimination complaints filed against courthouse security over the past 3 years. Each complaint was investigated by Administrator Kim in consultation with Barrett himself. Not one resulted in disciplinary action, additional training, or policy changes." She opened the binder to a section marked with colored tabs. "These are follow-up interviews with the complainants. 12 of them reported being discouraged from pursuing their complaints further. 5 were told their concerns were unfounded. 3 were advised that pursuing the matter could damage their standing with the court." Torres made notes rapidly. The pattern Zaria was documenting went beyond negligence into active suppression of civil rights complaints. Furthermore, Zaria continued, this administrative failure created a culture where Barrett felt comfortable sending text messages like these. She read from Barrett's phone records. "Had to deal with another uppity one today. Thinks she belongs in the judge's elevator." The message was sent 3 weeks before the assault. Chen leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of institutional failure. "Judge Washington, what systemic changes do you believe are necessary?" "First, independent oversight of all courthouse security with mandatory bias training conducted by external organizations, not courthouse administration. Second, a federal ombudsman system where discrimination complaints are investigated by personnel with no connection to the courthouse where the incident occurred. Third, mandatory body cameras for all security personnel with footage automatically preserved for civil rights review." Rodriguez added to her notes as Zaria continued. "Fourth, diversification of courthouse security staff with hiring preferences for personnel, with experience in bias recognition and de-escalation. Fifth, creation of clear protocols that prevent security staff from making subjective determinations about who looks like they belong in restricted areas. And sixth," Zaria's voice grew stronger, "establishment of a federal database tracking discrimination complaints across all courthouses so patterns can be identified before they escalate to violence." The recommendations were comprehensive, expensive, and, everyone in the room realized, absolutely necessary. Torres's phone buzzed with an urgent message from the White House. "President wants to address the nation tonight. Judge Washington's reforms will be adopted immediately across all federal courthouses." "Judge Washington," Torres said, "the President would like to implement your recommendations as emergency federal policy. Are you prepared to oversee a national reform effort while simultaneously beginning your judicial duties?" Zaria had anticipated this request. "General Torres, I've spent 15 years preparing to serve as a federal judge. But if my assault can prevent other people from experiencing the same violation, then yes, I'm prepared to lead that effort." In the gallery, Maya Sterling wiped away tears as she watched her boss transform personal trauma into systemic reform that would protect thousands of future courthouse visitors. Chen reviewed his notes one final time. "Judge Washington, this investigation began with an assault on you personally. How do you want it to end?" Zaria's answer was delivered with the authority that would define her judicial career. "I want it to end with the assurance that when a black child visits a federal courthouse 20 years from now as a defendant, attorney, witness, or judge, they will be treated with the same dignity and respect as any other American." She paused, looking around the room at faces that represented the federal judiciary's past failures and future potential. "Justice cannot be colorblind if the people administering it are not." The words would be carved into the wall of the new Federal Courthouse Diversity and Inclusion Center, established with funding approved by Congress 3 months later. Barrett and Weatherby were ultimately sentenced to federal prison terms of 18 months each. Hampton retired in disgrace, his federal pension reduced to reflect his administrative failures. Kim was banned from federal employment and faced civil lawsuits from dozens of discrimination victims. But the real legacy of that morning in the courthouse rotunda was measured not in punishments, but in the millions of Americans who would visit federal courthouses in the years to come and find them to be places where their dignity was protected rather than challenged. 6 months after the assault that shocked the American judicial system, Judge Zaria Washington stood in the same courthouse rotunda where she had been physically attacked by security guards who couldn't believe a black woman could be a federal judge. The transformation was remarkable. Where Keith Barrett had once blocked her path, now stood Officer Maria Santos, a former civil rights investigator whose training in de-escalation and bias recognition had made her the model for the new federal courthouse security program. The metal detectors were now staffed by personnel who reflected the diversity of the communities they served. Most significantly, mounted on the marble wall where Zaria had been shoved, was a bronze plaque reading, "Federal courthouses serve all Americans with equal dignity under law. Discrimination has no place in the halls of justice." Judge Washington, Officer Santos said with professional respect, "The delegation from the European Court of Human Rights is here for their tour of the new security protocols." The visit was part of an international exchange program studying how American federal courts had transformed their approach to courthouse access following the Washington incident. Courts in 12 countries were implementing similar reforms. Zaria adjusted her judicial robes, the same ones that had been wrinkled during her assault, and smiled. "Thank you, Officer Santos. Are the cameras ready for the demonstration?" The security cameras were now part of a comprehensive monitoring system that used artificial intelligence to identify potential bias in security interactions. Every stop, every additional screening, every extended conversation was automatically flagged for review if patterns suggested discriminatory treatment. As Zaria walked through the courthouse, she passed the portraits that now lined the corridors. Images of diverse federal judges, prosecutors, and court personnel that reflected the reality of modern American justice rather than its historical limitations. In Courtroom 14A, where she now presided over federal cases, Zaria had implemented protocols that ensured equal treatment for all participants, regardless of appearance, accent, or social status. Her courtroom had become a model for bias-free judicial proceedings. "Your Honor," said Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Coleman during that afternoon's sentencing hearing, "the defendant's community service will be served at the new Federal Courthouse Diversity Center, where he will assist with bias training for court personnel." The Diversity Center, established with congressional funding, had become a national model for addressing institutional bias. Every federal courthouse employee, from security guards to senior judges, now completed annual training based on lessons learned from the Washington assault. Zaria reviewed the sentencing guidelines, remembering how different this courtroom felt now from the one where she had argued cases as a prosecutor. The changes weren't just procedural, they were cultural. After court adjourned, Zaria returned to her chambers where Maya Sterling was coordinating the final details of the National Courthouse Reform Initiative. "Judge," Maya said, "the quarterly discrimination complaint statistics just came in. Federal courthouses are reporting a 78% decrease in bias-related incidents since implementation of the new protocols." "And complaint resolution?" Zaria asked. "Average investigation time has dropped from 6 months to 3 weeks, with independent oversight ensuring thorough review of all allegations." The transformation had exceeded everyone's expectations. The assault that was supposed to end Zaria's judicial career before it began had instead catalyzed the most comprehensive civil rights reform in federal judiciary history. Zaria's phone buzzed with a text from Senator Williams. House Judiciary Committee voted unanimously to make courthouse reforms permanent law. President signing ceremony next week. The legislative victory meant that the changes implemented as emergency policy would become permanent federal law, ensuring that future administrations couldn't roll back the protections that had emerged from that terrible morning in the courthouse rotunda. As evening approached, Zaria stood at her chamber windows overlooking Lower Manhattan. The same streets that had brought her to the courthouse 6 months ago for what should have been the proudest moment of her career now represented something even more significant, proof that individual trauma could become collective transformation. Maya knocked on her door. "Judge, there's someone here to see you." In walked Cole Hampton, the former chief judge who had lost his position due to his administrative failures. He looked older, humbled, and genuinely remorseful. "Judge Washington," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you personally before I finish cleaning out my office." "Thank me?" "For not letting us bury this, for refusing to protect the institution at the expense of justice, for forcing us to become the federal judiciary we always claimed to be." Hampton's words carried the weight of someone who had learned that protecting institutional reputation without addressing institutional failures ultimately destroys both. "Chief Judge Hampton," Zaria replied, "the system we built together will protect judges and courthouse visitors for generations. That's a legacy worth losing a job for." As Hampton left, Zaria returned to her desk to review the next day's cases. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to ensure that federal justice was administered with the equality and dignity that every American deserved. The bronze plaque in the rotunda would remind visitors that federal courthouses had been transformed, but Zaria Washington would spend the next 30 years of her judicial career ensuring that transformation was permanent. Justice, she had learned, was not colorblind. It required constant vigilance to ensure that bias never again masqueraded as security, that assumptions never again escalated to assault, and that federal courthouses truly served all Americans with equal dignity under law. 6 months after being assaulted in her own courthouse, Judge Zaria Washington had transformed American justice itself. Thank you to everyone who typed justice, and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and justice. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth.